My name is Lily, and at 30 years old, I'm ready to share a part of my life that I've kept hidden due to its painful nature. Life often brings unexpected events that can turn our world upside down, and my story is one of those. I could never have anticipated living in turmoil over a truth that I still find difficult to embrace. Contrary to the typical tales of love and familial bliss, my journey is filled with compromises and suppressed feelings. While many believe that love is the foundation of marriage, I understood early on that this wasn't the case for my mother and stepfather. From the moment he entered our lives, something felt amiss. Over time, I began to see that my mother was merely a pretext. I was the real reason behind his decision to marry her. My mother, Yelissa, owned a modest fashion boutique. After my father's passing during my childhood, she single-handedly raised me while nurturing her business into a beloved community establishment. Her strength and independence have always inspired me. Life proceeded in a stable, serene manner, with my mother dedicated to her shop and me concentrating on my education. As I transitioned into university life, I found myself stepping out of my mother's protective shadow and exploring the broader world. University introduced me to a host of new experiences, and among them was meeting Mr. Matthew, who was not just a philosophy lecturer but also my stepfather. From the outset, I was captivated by Mr. Matthew's teaching style. His lectures not only deepened my understanding of philosophy, but also altered my perspective on life. Our after-class discussions grew more frequent, and I recognized his profound influence on me. However, over time, I became aware of an unsettling intensity in his gaze. Initially dismissing it as my imagination, the feeling grew too strong to ignore. His eyes conveyed more than a teacher-student relationship, they held a deeper, unsaid complexity. This silent, intimate gaze left me feeling uneasy, as though he expected something I couldn't articulate. Though I questioned if I was overthinking, the peculiarity was undeniable. As this awareness sharpened, I noticed other unusual behaviors. Whenever I interacted with him or walked by, he would position himself closer, occasionally placing a hand on my shoulder in a way that unsettled me. These seemingly innocuous gestures began to weigh heavily on me. On one occasion, he kept me after class under the guise of discussing the lecture, but the conversation felt more like an excuse to linger. His unnecessary gaze and unwarranted intimacy left me feeling trapped and uncomfortable. I no longer sensed the respect and professional distance essential in a teacher-student relationship. Gradually, I distanced myself from him, concocting excuses to avoid private meetings. When he offered assistance, I declined, citing busyness, though my true intent was to maintain space. In an effort to distance myself from Mr. Matthew, I began sitting further away in class, avoiding eye contact, and occasionally arriving late to dodge any encounters before lessons began. I believed that by steering clear of him, the unsettling feelings would dissipate. Without those uncomfortable looks and actions, perhaps the anxiety would subside. Throughout the remainder of the school year, I successfully limited our interactions. Maintaining this distance seemed to restore a sense of normalcy, and I felt reassured that the awkwardness had been left behind. However, the peace I had crafted was short-lived. Upon returning home after a year at university, I noticed a change in my mother. Her demeanor was brighter, her eyes sparkled with a hidden joy, and she often chuckled to herself, as if harboring a delightful secret. Curious, I questioned her, but she merely attributed her cheerfulness to life improving. One afternoon, as we sat together in the living room, my mother joined me with a radiant smile and eyes glistening with happiness. She confided that she had met someone special, and was eager for me to meet him. Witnessing her joy, I felt a surge of happiness for her too. For years, she had dedicated herself entirely to raising me, often at the expense of her own happiness. It was a relief to see her finally finding the joy she deserved. The day arrived when she was to introduce me to this man, and I was filled with anticipation. The house was tidied up, and my mother meticulously set the dining table. Her excitement was palpable, and I hoped this man would bring her the fulfillment she longed for. When the doorbell chimed, my heart skipped a beat. My mother hurried to answer the door, while I waited in the living room, imagining the man who would become part of her life. As the door opened and Mr. Matthew stepped inside, I was struck by an overwhelming sense of disbelief. I stood frozen, unable to comprehend the sight before me. All the unease I had felt about him came flooding back. The man my mother cherished, the one she introduced with such joy, was the very person I'd been avoiding. A whirlwind of conflicting emotions erupted within me. Why him? How did they meet? What were his intentions? The discomfort in my heart intensified. Memories of his unsettling gaze and gestures resurfaced, clouding my thoughts. The concerns I had tried to suppress were now unmistakably clear. I glanced at my mother, hoping she sensed the oddity of the situation, but she remained blissfully unaware. She continued smiling, introducing Matthew as if nothing was amiss. To her, this was simply the introduction of a loved one, oblivious to the storm his presence was causing within me. Mr. Matthew entered with a calm smile, exuding friendliness and politeness. He greeted me, feigning surprise and claiming he hadn't realized I was Ulysses' daughter. I played along, masking my inner turmoil with feigned astonishment. My mother, unaware of the turmoil in my mind, laughed and expressed delight at the coincidence of Matthew being my teacher. They chatted enthusiastically, marveling at this unexpected connection, while I remained silent, a sense of insecurity enveloping me. I couldn't stop questioning who Mr. Matthew truly was, and why he had inserted himself into my mother's life in a role so different from what I knew. Was this truly just a coincidence, or was there an underlying truth I was missing? From that moment forward, life seemed to proceed as usual. Matthew showed no peculiar behavior, and nothing gave me cause for concern. My mother and Matthew grew increasingly close, their bond appearing utterly genuine. Seeing my mother happier than ever, with her radiant smile and daily joy, reassured me. Not long after, she decided to marry Matthew, who officially became my stepfather. Everything unfolded smoothly, no odd incidents disrupted our family life, which remained serene and stable. As time went on without any alarming signs, I began to realize I might have been overthinking. Maybe my initial anxiety was merely the result of adjusting to changes in my mother's life and my own. Observing her happiness, I gradually released my doubts and insecurities. My mother's beaming smiles with Matthew convinced me that the most important thing was her newfound joy. Finally, I accepted their relationship wholeheartedly and offered them my blessings. I wanted her to continue basking in happiness and learn to embrace Matthew as a member of our family. Over time, with no unusual behavior from Matthew, I started to question my previous fears. I wondered if I had let my imagination get the best of me. Watching my mother thrive in her relationship with him, I felt a sense of relief. Ultimately, I felt genuine happiness for my mother and wished her well, hoping her life remained joyful. I believed everything would continue peacefully. With no signs of concern from Matthew, I grew more at ease. I stopped worrying about my stepfather, as he consistently displayed kindness and care towards my mother and our family. I became convinced that my earlier anxieties were baseless. By the time I turned 22 and had graduated from university, I was seeking my first job. While I hadn't yet found the right opportunity, I decided to help my mother at her fashion store. Spending more time together, Matthew often visited to lend a hand with small tasks in his spare time. Everything seemed to run smoothly, and I no longer harbored doubts about Matthew. I truly believed he was a devoted husband to my mother, and had become an integral part of my life. But then, on what became the worst day of my life, everything changed. That day I fell ill, the fever sapping my strength, leaving me unable to accompany my mother to the store. She encouraged me to rest at home, and I didn't think twice about it. Matthew, my stepfather, was the only one home with me, as he didn't have any commitments that day. Initially, I felt no apprehension or suspicion. After years of living together, I trusted him as a good-hearted person who deeply loved my mother. I lay in bed, attempting to sleep away the fever's discomfort. However, my peace was short-lived. The unthinkable happened that day, in the very home I considered my sanctuary. Matthew entered my room with a glass of water and some pills, claiming they were painkillers to alleviate my fever. His demeanor was gentle and caring, nothing that would raise suspicion. The fever muddled my thoughts, and I didn't question his intentions. I just wanted relief, so I accepted the pills and swallowed them without hesitation. I drank the water, unaware that this moment marked the beginning of an ordeal. Everything seemed ordinary, and I detected no warning signs. After ingesting the pills, I felt no immediate change. The effects of the medication didn't seem immediate, leaving me fully conscious of my surroundings. I lay there expecting the fever to eventually subside. However, after about 20 minutes, everything began to change. Matthew re-entered the room, this time empty-handed. A troubling look in his eyes set off alarm bells, and as I attempted to sit up, I was shocked to find myself immobilized. A wave of paralysis spread through my body, draining all my strength. Panic surged within me as I fought against this overwhelming helplessness, yet I remained motionless, eyes wide open, as Matthew drew nearer. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the glint in his eyes, which sent a shiver down my spine. I struggled, tried to move, but my body was unresponsive, not even a finger would obey my commands. The sense of powerlessness was terrifying, and it intensified as Matthew leaned down, his face mere inches from mine, with a chilling smile. Gone was the friendly, gentle expression, it was replaced by something cold and sinister. Then he whispered, his voice soft yet unmistakably clear, "I've waited for this opportunity for a long time." Horror enveloped me, unable to process what I'd just heard. My mind reeled, trying to grasp the situation, but everything crumbled around me. The fears and doubts I'd dismissed as imagination suddenly crystallized into a harsh reality. Matthew sat beside me, his eyes calculating, his smile menacing. Helpless, unable to resist, I was forced to listen to every word he spoke. Each sentence resonated, slowly unveiling a horrifying truth I had never anticipated. He confessed that from the moment I started college, he had been infatuated with me and sought ways to get closer. Despite his attempts, my persistent distance thwarted him, leading him to pursue a different path into my life. Matthew began researching me, uncovering personal details and my family background. Upon learning about my mother and our situation, he decided the only way to approach me was through her. He set out to win my mother's trust and affection. Everything unfolded smoothly for him, and before I knew it, he was my mother's husband, entwined in our family life. Hearing this revelation felt like plummeting into a chasm of despair. I couldn't fathom how meticulously orchestrated everything around me had been. What I had perceived as my mother's newfound happiness was merely a facade, a scheme with the ultimate goal of reaching me. The realization filled me with profound pain and revulsion, knowing that from the beginning, it was all part of his calculated plan. As he finished speaking, Matthew moved closer, his eyes brimming with satisfaction at my helpless state. I lay there defenseless as Matthew approached, the warmth my mother saw in him now replaced by greed and coldness. I attempted to retreat, but nothing responded. My heart thudded in my chest, yet my body felt locked, unyielding to my will. He leaned down, his hands moving over me, inciting a wave of disgust I couldn't dispel. He took control, disregarding my helplessness. I lay there enduring every moment of his violation. Seconds stretched into an eternity, and all I could do was silently plead for it to end. But it didn't. The world around me shattered, the peace I once knew torn apart by his actions. I yearned to fight back, to break free, but it was futile. Matthew persisted, and my body no longer felt like my own. Time crawled agonizingly, each second stretching into an unending nightmare. Helpless, I stared at the ceiling, desperately trying to escape from reality, but the horror continued, lingering and excruciating. The paralysis, the loss of control, fueled my fear with every passing second. Each touch felt like a blow to my self-worth, breaking me into pieces that I couldn't put back together. I felt utterly detached from my own body, completely dominated by him. Everything unfolded with torturous slowness, leaving me powerless to fight back. Every moment felt like an eternity, and I longed for it all to end. When it finally did, I lay there, feeling hollow and numb. The room was cold and suffocating, stripped of life. Matthew stood, adjusting his clothes nonchalantly, as if nothing had occurred, while I remained motionless, trapped in the horror of what had just transpired. My world had imploded. Everything I had known was now void and meaningless. My mind was a whirlwind of unanswered questions, filled with pain and rage. I couldn't comprehend why this had happened. How could the man my mother loved, whom I had tried to accept as family, do this to me? The blend of pain, fear, and betrayal suffocated me, leaving only helplessness and despair. Matthew spared me one last glance, his eyes devoid of remorse, before leaving the room, abandoning me with my torment and the haunting memories. I didn't know how to face this new reality, uncertain how to continue when everything felt shattered. As the drug's effects waned, control gradually returned to my limbs. Though weak and dizzy, I managed to stand. Each movement was excruciating, but I knew what I needed to do. My hands trembled as I adjusted my clothes, trying to erase the traces of horror. My gaze landed on the phone across the room. It was my lifeline, my only way to seek help and end this nightmare. Each step was a struggle as I approached, my hands still shaking as I picked up the receiver. I dialed 911, each number more challenging to press than the last. When the operator's voice came through, I took a deep breath, steadying my voice to recount everything. The police arrival felt instant, yet the wait seemed eternal. As they entered the house, the silence shattered. Voices echoed, footsteps hurried, and finally, Matthew was taken into custody. He offered no resistance, silently accepting his fate as the police handcuffed him. My mother returned soon after Matthew was arrested. Seeing me, trembling and frail, surrounded by officers, she initially didn't comprehend the situation. Our eyes met, and my remaining strength dissipated. Tears flowed as I confided everything to her. My voice cracked as I revealed the truth about Matthew, the horror he inflicted, and the nightmare I had endured. My mother was stunned, her eyes wide with disbelief and anguish. She remained silent throughout my story, frozen as her world crumbled around her. When I finished, she collapsed, overwhelmed by grief and regret. She blamed herself for not seeing the signs, for bringing someone like Matthew into our lives. Through her tears, she repeated, I'm sorry, but no apology could erase our pain. That day marked a permanent shift. My mother would never forgive herself, and I could never return to the life I once knew. After Matthew's arrest, a sense of relief washed over me, but the pain and trauma didn't vanish overnight. Though I had secured justice and confronted what he did, the lingering shadows of the ordeal remained. My mother, upon learning the full extent of the truth, sank into deep remorse and regret. She couldn't stop blaming herself for allowing Matthew into our lives and failing to see his true nature. Seeking solace, she chose to leave our home and temporarily close her fashion store to find some peace. Matthew's conviction ensured I would never encounter him again, yet the scars he left behind seemed indelible. He had tarnished a part of my life, and despite the passage of time, the hurt persisted, like a wound that would never fully heal. From this horrific experience, I understood that silence is never the solution to pain or fear. Confronting the truth, no matter how excruciating, is the only path to peace of mind. Concealment only prolongs suffering and erodes the soul. I also realized that, although my mother was unaware of what transpired, the trust she placed in Matthew, and in me, had unforeseen repercussions. Communicating and sharing thoughts and feelings with loved ones is crucial. Had I mustered the courage to speak up when I first sensed something amiss with Matthew, perhaps things might have unfolded differently. Even though Matthew faced justice and my mother recognized her oversight, our lives have not returned to normal. I must learn to coexist with the pain, with the haunting memories of the past, and seek solace in healing wounds that resist closure. As for my mother, she too must learn to forgive herself. Life continues, and the future remains uncertain. Yet, one certainty remains: I will no longer be silent. I am determined to move forward, regardless of the challenges ahead. Regret and pain may accompany me, but I know my journey toward healing has begun. Though the road is arduous, I refuse to be a victim of silence any longer. I will rediscover myself and reclaim the strength that was lost in that nightmare.